Internal audit froze a $3.1 million supplier contract at 8:12 on a Monday morning. Production planning stopped within the hour. Nobody on the executive floor understood why. The paperwork looked clean. Approved vendor. Signed procurement reviews. Budget authorization complete. But by lunchtime, legal was already inside the conference room reviewing supplier communications manually. That was when I realized leadership still had no idea what the audit team actually found. I had worked in industrial manufacturing outside Cleveland for more than 20 years. Officially, I was a senior process engineer. Unofficially, I was usually the person people called after something failed quietly 3 departments away. Production instability. Supplier inconsistencies. Inventory drift. Tolerance failures. Scale-up problems. Most executives only saw the finished dashboards. I saw the hidden corrections keeping those dashboards stable. That difference matters more than most companies understand. Over 2 decades, I helped design manufacturing systems that generated tens of millions in revenue for the group. Some of my process modifications became standard across multiple facilities. A few patents carried my name officially. Most operational improvements did not. That never bothered me much. Factories care about stability more than recognition. Or at least they should. Things changed after the vice president brought one of her longtime friends into the company as the new research and development director. At first, the changes looked political more than operational. New reporting layers, more executive reviews, longer presentation meetings, less time near actual production lines. The new director liked strategy sessions. I preferred plant floors. Different kind of people usually do. Within months, technical decisions started moving further away from manufacturing reality. Vendor selection meetings became unusually closed. Engineering review comments disappeared from final summaries. Procurement timelines accelerated without normal qualification pressure testing. That part bothered me immediately, because industrial manufacturing punishes shortcuts slowly at first. Then all at once, the vice president began excluding me from meetings tied to a major supplier transition project worth just over $3 million. Interesting decision, especially since I had helped build most of the production tolerances the new supplier would supposedly support. One afternoon, a purchasing manager quietly asked whether I had approved the latest supplier specification revisions. I had never seen them before. That conversation stayed with me. Because in companies like ours, technical approval pathways rarely break accidentally. Somebody usually wants them bypassed. After that, I started reviewing archived supplier qualification records privately during evenings. Revision histories, material testing reports, pilot production notes, tolerance deviation patterns. The deeper I looked, the more uncomfortable the timeline became. Several technical assumptions inside the supplier proposal did not match historical plant performance data. Not small differences, fundamental production risks. The kind that stay invisible during presentations but become catastrophic during scale manufacturing. Meanwhile, the vice president's group kept pushing the deal faster. More urgency, less review time, fewer engineering discussions. One executive even described the supplier transition as mostly administrative at this stage. Administrative. Interesting word choice again. Because anyone who truly understands manufacturing knows supplier qualification is never administrative once production scaling begins. Especially not at our volumes. Around that time, the new research and development director requested access to several archive process files tied to inventions I developed years earlier. Not summaries. Original engineering documentation. Pilot corrections. Tolerance adjustments. Failure reports. The request looked routine on paper. It was not. Because those files contained something most executives never understood properly. The inventions were not the valuable part. The correction history was. If you have ever watched leadership confuse political confidence with operational intelligence, subscribe now. Because 3 days before the audit freeze, I discovered the supplier's production capability report had been modified after engineering review approval. I noticed the modification around 10:40 that night. The engineering approval file carried my original tolerance review signature, but the production capability numbers attached afterward were different. Slightly different. Just enough to survive a presentation meeting. Not enough to survive real manufacturing volume. That distinction matters inside industrial production. Most executives think bad supplier decisions fail immediately. Usually they do not. They fail gradually through waste, instability, inventory distortion, maintenance overload, and inconsistent output nobody can explain cleanly. I printed the revision history before leaving the building, not because I planned to accuse anyone, because I had seen this pattern before. Years earlier, another supplier overstated thermal consistency ranges during a scale-up project in Indiana. Leadership ignored the warning signs then too. The production losses took almost 8 months to fully appear. By that point, nobody could isolate the original decision anymore. That is how bad industrial governance hides itself. Not through dramatic collapse, through delayed accountability. The next morning, the vice president held a supplier transition meeting on the executive floor. I was invited unexpectedly. That interested me immediately. For months, I had been excluded from discussions tied to the project. Now audit was involved. Suddenly, they wanted technical participation again. The room felt different before the meeting even started. Legal was present. Procurement looked nervous. Operations leadership stopped speaking casually. The vice president opened by describing the audit freeze as a temporary documentation inconsistency. Documentation inconsistency. Interesting phrase. Because the problem was not documentation. The problem was manufacturing reality. She asked me to review the supplier capability summary publicly during the meeting, probably expecting a narrow technical clarification. Instead, I asked a simple question first. Which production revision are we validating against? Nobody answered immediately. The research and development director eventually referenced the latest qualification packet. I already knew that packet contained altered capability assumptions. So I asked something else. When were the thermal tolerance limits updated after engineering approval? That changed the room instantly. Several executives started reviewing their printed files again. Procurement stopped taking notes. The vice president answered carefully. She described the revisions as optimization adjustments aligned with supplier recommendations. Optimization adjustments. Another dangerous phrase. Because manufacturing tolerances are not presentation language. Either the line can hold stability at scale, or it cannot. There is no executive wording capable of changing physics. I explained that the revised tolerances exceeded the supplier's historical production stability range based on archived qualification records. The silence afterward felt procedural, not emotional. People were recalculating risk privately. One operations director asked whether the supplier had ever successfully maintained those specifications during continuous production runs above 48 hours. I already knew the answer. No, not once. The vice president tried redirecting the discussion toward future efficiency improvements. But the meeting was already changing direction. Audit was no longer reviewing paperwork. They were reviewing decision logic. That distinction became very important afterward. Later that afternoon, one of the plant managers from Toledo called me directly. He lowered his voice before speaking. Then he asked whether leadership truly understood what would happen if the supplier failed during full-scale production ramp-up. I looked across the production floor before answering. No, I do not think they understand how many downstream systems are already built around assumptions that only work if the supplier data was real. The manager stayed quiet for several seconds. Then he said something that bothered me immediately. The supplier already shipped pilot material to the plant last week without final engineering authorization. The unauthorized pilot shipment changed the situation immediately. Not publicly, operationally. Because once production material enters the plant, assumptions become measurable, and measurable assumptions create accountability. I drove to the Toledo facility the next morning before sunrise. The plant manager met me near receiving. No executive escorts. No presentation slides. Just warehouse noise and exhausted supervisors trying to keep production moving. That was usually where the truth lived in companies like ours. Not conference rooms. The pilot material was already isolated near quality control. 3 pallets. Rushed labeling. Incomplete thermal certification records. I recognized the supplier packaging sequence immediately. They had accelerated shipment preparation before final validation approval. That meant someone expected the approval process to become procedural instead of technical. Very dangerous assumption. The plant manager walked me through the initial production observations quietly. Nothing catastrophic yet. But operators already noticed instability patterns during limited trial runs. Temperature variance. Inconsistent density. Unexpected machine calibration drift. Small deviations. Exactly the kind executives ignore before scale manufacturing magnifies them into expensive operational problems. I requested the original production samples from the previous approved supplier for comparison. The difference became obvious within 30 minutes. Not visually, behaviorally. The material responded differently under sustained thermal cycling. That matters enormously during continuous manufacturing, especially at our production volumes. I documented everything carefully, not emotionally, operationally. Thermal response patterns, tolerance drift, calibration irregularities, operator feedback, inventory risk projections. The deeper I reviewed the numbers, the clearer the real issue became. The supplier was not necessarily fraudulent. They were simply incapable of maintaining stable production quality at the scale leadership promised investors and procurement teams. That distinction mattered, because incompetence creates damage differently than corruption. Around noon, the vice president arrived unexpectedly with the research and development director. Both wore the same expression executives usually carry when operational reality interrupts political momentum: controlled irritation. The vice president immediately reframed the trial instability as normal optimization friction. Another dangerous phrase. Factories do not care about executive language. Machines respond to tolerances. Materials respond to physics. Production lines expose reality eventually. The research and development director attempted explaining the calibration drift through temporary environmental factors. One operator standing nearby looked down immediately after hearing that. He had been running the same line for 12 years. People like him always know when leadership starts inventing explanations faster than evidence. I asked the vice president a simple question. Had procurement reviewed the supplier's continuous production failure history from the Indiana facility 4 years earlier? That stopped the conversation immediately, because she clearly did not know the history existed. The supplier had already failed a scale-up project once before. Different industry. Same instability pattern. That information never appeared inside the executive summary documents. Interesting omission. The vice president asked where I obtained the records. I answered honestly. Archived qualification reviews. The kind older engineers keep reading after everyone else moves on to the next presentation. Nobody responded immediately after that. The plant manager eventually broke the silence. He asked whether production should continue testing or isolate the remaining pilot inventory. I already knew what leadership wanted him to hear. Keep moving. Avoid delays. Protect timelines. Instead, I answered differently. If the tolerance drift expands during full-scale production, inventory instability will spread faster than procurement can contain it afterward. The vice president stared at me for several seconds after that. Then she asked something very carefully. How many people inside this company actually know about the supplier's earlier production failure history? I looked toward the production floor first, then back at the unfinished qualification reports sitting in front of legal review stickers. Far fewer than should have known before the contract reached executive approval. The Toledo trial results reached executive leadership by Friday afternoon. By then, the language inside meetings had already started changing. Nobody called the supplier transition efficient anymore. Now it was manageable, recoverable, under review. Corporate vocabulary always shifts before accountability does. I stayed mostly inside the plants during that period. Cleveland, Toledo, Fort Wayne. Production supervisors trusted numbers more than presentations. That helped. Operators began documenting instability patterns independently once they realized engineering concerns were real. Machine recalibration frequency increased. Thermal balancing drift expanded. Waste percentages climbed gradually during longer runs. Nothing catastrophic individually. That was the dangerous part. Industrial instability rarely arrives dramatically at first. It spreads through tolerances. One afternoon, I reviewed inventory forecasting with a senior planning manager who looked more exhausted every week. He pointed toward revised production projections and asked whether I believed the supplier could stabilize after additional optimization cycles. I answered honestly. The issue is not optimization anymore. The issue is scaling consistency under continuous manufacturing pressure. That distinction mattered enormously, because executives still believed they were managing a difficult supplier transition. They were actually approaching systemic production instability, and the deeper problem extended beyond manufacturing. That was the realization leadership still had not reached. The supplier deal touched inventory timing, procurement exposure, client delivery schedules, maintenance forecasting, quality reporting, and investor production guidance simultaneously. One unstable vendor could distort the operational credibility of the entire division. That was the real risk, not the defective material itself. The company had built downstream planning assumptions around production numbers that only worked if the supplier's capability claims were true. And now Audit was beginning to compare those claims against historical performance records leadership never reviewed carefully enough. That became the midpoint nobody understood yet. The vice president believed this was still a procurement controversy. It was becoming a governance event. Late Monday morning, executive leadership held another operational review meeting near headquarters outside Cleveland. Legal attended again. So did internal audit. That combination changed room behavior immediately. People spoke slower. Fewer interruptions. No speculative optimism. The research and development director presented revised stabilization projections tied to additional calibration procedures. The charts looked polished. The production data did not. I noticed something else during the meeting too. Several operational assumptions inside the presentation depended on production correction behavior that only existed because experienced plant teams were compensating manually in real time. Invisible adjustments, temporary workarounds, line balancing corrections. The same pattern I had spent 20 years watching inside manufacturing systems. Leadership kept mistaking human intervention for supplier stability. That misunderstanding was much larger than one contract. Near the end of the meeting, internal audit asked whether the supplier qualification scoring process had been independently reviewed before executive approval. The vice president answered yes immediately. Audit then requested the original scoring history, not summaries, original revisions. Nobody moved for several seconds afterward, because everyone in the room suddenly understood the same dangerous possibility. If the scoring history changed after engineering review, the problem was no longer operational pressure. It became intentional governance exposure. After the meeting ended, one audit manager stopped me near the elevators. He lowered his voice before speaking. Then he asked whether I believed the supplier instability was the biggest risk the company faced right now. I looked back toward the conference room glass first. Executives were already reopening production reports manually again. Then I answered carefully, no. The biggest risk is that leadership still thinks this problem started with the supplier. After that conversation, audit activity expanded quietly across the company. Not publicly. Most employees still believe the issue involved a difficult supplier transition. Inside operations, the atmosphere felt very different. People stopped trusting executive summaries. Plant managers began requesting raw production reports directly. Procurement teams reopened archived qualification files. Quality control supervisors started documenting operator adjustments more aggressively than before. The invisible corrections were becoming visible. That always changes organizational behavior. I spent most of that week reviewing older supplier records from previous scale-up projects. Not because audit requested them, because I already understood something leadership still resisted accepting. The supplier problem was only exposing a deeper structural weakness. For years, the company rewarded presentation confidence faster than operational memory. That imbalance rarely appears on quarterly reports immediately. But factories remember everything eventually, especially bad assumptions. One afternoon, internal audit requested a private technical review with me and 2 manufacturing directors. No executives. No procurement leadership. That detail mattered, because audit had stopped relying entirely on executive interpretation. They wanted operational reality directly from the people who managed the systems daily. The review lasted almost 4 hours. We walked through tolerance histories, pilot failures, production scaling risks, supplier capability drift, manual line corrections, and inventory exposure. The audit manager asked better questions than most executives had in years. Not because he understood manufacturing deeply, because he understood pattern risk. Near the end of the session, he asked why my name appeared repeatedly across successful stabilization projects going back more than a decade. I answered honestly, because most large-scale manufacturing systems are not truly stable. Experienced teams stabilize them continuously. The room stayed quiet after that. Not dramatic silence. Recognition silence. One manufacturing director leaned back slowly and said something I had heard many times privately over the years. Most executives think production consistency comes from machinery. not people. That sentence explained almost the entire situation. The vice president spent years building authority around visibility, presentations, executive access, political alignment. Meanwhile, operational continuity depended heavily on workers, engineers, and supervisors quietly correcting instability before leadership ever saw it. That was the invisible map nobody documented properly. Late Friday afternoon, Audit requested the original supplier scoring spreadsheets tied to the $3.1 million contract. Procurement submitted the finalized version first. Audit rejected it immediately. They wanted revision history, not the polished outcome. The history. That distinction changed the emotional temperature across leadership almost overnight. Because revision history exposes intent, not just decisions. Around 6:30 that evening, one procurement analyst called me privately from the parking garage outside headquarters. He sounded nervous. Then he told me something that explained why audit pressure suddenly escalated so aggressively. The supplier scoring sheet had not just been adjusted after engineering review. Entire risk categories disappeared from the final executive version before approval signatures were collected. The missing risk categories changed everything. Because once audit detects removed risk factors inside procurement scoring, the issue stops being operational. It becomes governance exposure. The following Monday, legal joined the manufacturing review sessions permanently. Not occasionally, permanently. That detail spread through the company faster than any official announcement. People noticed legal presence immediately inside industrial organizations, especially near active production projects. Meetings became quieter after that. Executives stopped improvising explanations. Procurement directors started reviewing old approvals before speaking publicly. The vice president looked increasingly irritated during operational reviews. Not frightened yet, just frustrated that technical resistance was slowing her timeline. That was the problem with executives who spent too much time around presentations. They mistake friction for disloyalty. Factories do not work that way. Physics does not negotiate with authority. I spent several days reconstructing archived supplier qualification histories for audit. Not because anyone ordered me to. Because the original documentation structure was fragmented across years of revisions, plant testing, and engineering adjustments. That was another invisible system leadership never understood properly. Institutional memory rarely exists in one database. Usually it lives inside experienced people quietly connecting incomplete information. Audit started recognizing that pattern too. One internal auditor eventually told me something interesting during a late review session near the Cleveland plant. He said every stable manufacturing system he investigated eventually revealed the same hidden layer. Experienced personnel correcting reality faster than management reports could measure it. That sentence stayed with me, because it explained why leadership often misunderstands operational stability completely. They see outcomes. They rarely see the human correction architecture underneath them. By Wednesday afternoon, Audit had reconstructed enough of the supplier scoring revisions to identify where the qualification risk categories disappeared. The edits happened gradually across multiple versions. Not one dramatic rewrite. Small adjustments. Language softening. Reclassification changes. Tolerance weighting reductions. Individually, each revision looked procedural. Together, they changed the entire risk profile of the supplier approval. That is how institutional manipulation usually works. Quietly, incrementally, professionally formatted. The vice president attempted reframing the revisions as cross-functional alignment decisions during another executive review meeting. Audit did not argue emotionally. They simply projected the revision timeline beside historical engineering warnings. That comparison damaged the room instantly, because for the first time, executives could visually see the divergence between operational reality and executive presentation language. One board liaison attended remotely that afternoon. Nobody expected that. Board involvement changes executive behavior very quickly, especially when procurement and legal risk begin overlapping. Near the end of the meeting, the research and development director tried defending the supplier's projected scalability again. Then Audit asked her a simple technical question. What historical continuous run data supported the revised tolerance assumptions? She paused too long before answering. Not because she lacked intelligence, because she had never actually lived inside production systems long enough to recognize how dangerous the assumptions were. That was the real fracture underneath the entire situation. Leadership promoted visibility over operational depth, and now Audit was uncovering the cost of that decision layer by layer. After the meeting ended, one of the senior board advisors requested direct access to all archived engineering qualification correspondence tied to the supplier transition. Not summaries, original communication chains. That request mattered enormously, because original communication history does not just expose what people approved. It exposes what they already knew before approving it. Once the board advisors requested original communication records, the atmosphere inside the company shifted again. Not louder, more careful. Executives started reviewing old emails before meetings. Procurement managers delayed approvals, waiting for secondary verification. Several department heads suddenly wanted engineering input restored into workflows they previously treated as administrative formalities. Interesting timing. For years, operational review was considered inefficient. Now everyone wanted operational traceability. I stayed mostly away from executive politics during that period. The plants still needed stability. Production schedules still moved every morning whether leadership understood the risk or not. That was another thing corporate executives often forget. Factories do not pause for organizational embarrassment. One afternoon near the Cleveland facility, I walked through line 4 with a maintenance supervisor who had worked there nearly as long as I had. He pointed toward a recalibration sequence operators recently added during pilot material testing. Manual adjustment, temporary compensation, continuous monitoring. Exactly the kind of invisible intervention executives never measure. The supervisor shook his head quietly while reviewing the output variance reports. Then he said something simple. The line is working harder than the supplier is. That sentence explained the entire system failure better than most executive presentations could. Leadership kept interpreting temporary human correction behavior as supplier capability. The factory operators knew better immediately, because operators live inside physical reality all day. Late that week, Audit reconstructed the full supplier scoring revision chain. The timeline showed multiple risk reductions appearing shortly after executive review meetings involving the vice president and the research and development director. No direct fraud language appeared anywhere. That was important. Corporate governance failures rarely arrive through obvious criminal language. They emerge through pressure, alignment, expedited approvals, and selective interpretation. Professional wording can hide enormous risk until production data forces reality back into the room. The board advisors scheduled a formal governance review the following Tuesday. That announcement spread tension across leadership immediately. Board-level reviews change careers. Everyone understood that. The vice president stopped speaking aggressively after that. Now she focused on process framing instead. Miscommunication, alignment gaps, documentation inconsistency. Interesting evolution. Because earlier she described the supplier transition as strategically optimized, now it was suddenly procedural confusion. The company's legal department noticed the shift too. One counsel asked during review whether any engineering objections were formally removed or softened before final executive approval. Nobody answered quickly. That silence carried more weight than most statements. I provided Audit with archived engineering review chains afterward. Original comments, thermal warnings, scale-up concerns, production risk projections. Nothing emotional, just records. The deeper Audit moved into the history, the clearer another pattern became. The supplier issue was not isolated. The company had spent years concentrating operational influence around politically protected leadership while quietly minimizing experienced technical resistance. That imbalance finally became measurable. Near the end of the week, the chairman requested a closed-door operational briefing with only audit, legal, and senior manufacturing personnel present. No procurement leadership. No research and development executives. That exclusion mattered enormously. Because for the first time since the crisis began, the company was no longer asking leadership to explain operational reality. It was asking the factory systems directly. The closed-door operational briefing happened on a rainy Tuesday morning outside Cleveland. Different room, different tone, no polished presentations, no strategy language, just audit binders, engineering records, and production data spread across a long conference table. The chairman arrived 10 minutes early. That alone changed the atmosphere. People sat straighter when ownership entered the room directly, especially during governance reviews. The board advisors focused almost entirely on operational continuity, not personalities, not departmental politics. That mattered, because once governance pressure reaches manufacturing systems directly, evidence starts carrying more weight than hierarchy. Audit presented the supplier's scoring timeline first. Revision history, removed risk categories, modified tolerance weighting, accelerated qualification approvals. Then engineering records appeared beside the procurement changes. The comparison damaged the executive narrative immediately, not dramatically, structurally. The production risks had been visible inside the technical review process long before final approval signatures were collected. One board advisor asked a simple question. Why did operational concerns keep disappearing as the contract moved upward through leadership review? Nobody answered immediately. The vice president attempted explaining the revisions through cross-functional efficiency alignment again. But the room no longer responded to presentation language the same way. The board had already seen the production instability reports. They had already reviewed audit timelines. They had already spoken privately with plant leadership. That was the final turn most executives inside the company still did not fully understand. The board was no longer investigating whether instability existed. They were investigating who ignored the warnings before the instability became measurable. That distinction changed everything. Around halfway through the meeting, legal introduced another issue leadership clearly had not anticipated becoming part of the review. A major customer account had already requested clarification regarding long-term production consistency projections tied to the supplier transition. Not publicly, privately, weeks earlier, before the audit freeze officially happened. The room became very still after that, because for the first time, everyone understood the operational damage had already moved beyond internal governance exposure. External confidence had started weakening before leadership admitted the supplier risk internally. That realization hit harder than the audit findings themselves. Executives can survive internal disagreement. Customers questioning manufacturing reliability creates a very different level of pressure. The chairman reviewed the customer correspondence personally in silence. Then he asked audit whether the production instability risk was isolated to one supplier decision. The audit manager answered carefully, no. The supplier issue exposed a broader pattern of operational risk minimization during executive approval review. That sentence stayed in the room afterward, not because it sounded dramatic, because everyone understood what it actually meant. The company had slowly trained leadership systems to reward momentum more aggressively than technical resistance, and factories eventually punished that imbalance. Near the end of the meeting, the chairman requested one final clarification from me directly. He asked how long experienced manufacturing teams had been compensating manually for unstable executive assumptions without formal recognition. I looked down at the production correction records spread across the table first. Years of undocumented adjustments, line balancing, thermal corrections, inventory sequencing, supplier workarounds, invisible labor holding visible stability together. Then I answered honestly. Long enough that most executives probably stopped realizing the corrections were happening at all. The chairman nodded once after that. Then legal suspended the supplier contract formally, pending expanded governance review and external counsel evaluation. After legal suspended the supplier contract, the company changed very quickly. Not emotionally, structurally. Executive meetings became smaller. Engineering review authority expanded again. Procurement approvals required documented operational validation before board review. The language inside the organization changed too. People stopped saying efficiency when they meant speed. They stopped calling technical resistance negativity. And suddenly, everyone wanted traceability. Interesting how governance becomes important only after instability becomes expensive. The vice president remained inside the company briefly during the expanded review process. But her authority changed almost overnight. Meetings moved around her instead of through her. Audit controlled the timeline now. Legal controlled communication. The board controlled final review. Political influence weakens quickly once operational credibility collapses. The research and development director struggled even more. Not because she lacked intelligence, because she never understood the factory systems deeply enough to recognize where presentation logic stopped and production reality began. That difference eventually becomes measurable. Factories always expose assumptions, especially expensive ones. Over the next several weeks, expanded governance reviews uncovered more procurement irregularities tied to accelerated supplier approvals and reduced engineering waiting during executive review cycles. Nothing cinematic. No dramatic arrests. No shouting matches. Just documentation. Revision histories. Risk reclassification patterns. Communication timelines. Approval pressure sequences. Corporate damage usually arrives through records, not explosions. The company eventually pursued legal action tied to procurement governance violations and conflict of interest exposure involving several leadership personnel and outside vendor relationships. Most of that process stayed private. Large companies prefer controlled correction over public embarrassment. I stayed mostly inside the plants during those months. Production still needed stabilization. Operators still needed support. Machines still required calibration every morning regardless of executive failure. That part never changes. One afternoon near the Toledo facility, I watched a newer engineer helping operators troubleshoot thermal drift on one of the older production lines. He reminded me of myself 20 years earlier. Focused, quiet, still listening more than talking. The maintenance supervisor beside me nodded toward him and said something simple. Good engineers always notice the corrections first. That stayed with me, because the invisible corrections were always the real story. Not the patents, not the executive politics, not even the supplier contract. The real story was the hidden architecture holding unstable systems together quietly for years while leadership mistook the stability for permanent infrastructure. A few months later, the chairman asked whether I would help redesign the company's operational governance structure permanently. I accepted carefully. Not because I trusted leadership completely again, because the plants still mattered, the workers still mattered, and institutional memory disappears faster than executives realize once experienced people stop carrying it forward. The company survived. Most companies do. But the culture changed after that review process. Engineering authority became formalized. Supplier qualification controls expanded. Operational review gained independent escalation power. Production risk weighting could no longer be removed quietly during executive approval cycles. The invisible systems finally became visible enough to protect properly. I never felt victorious about any of it. Mostly tired. Not from the audit. From watching how easily organizations consume invisible expertise while convincing themselves stability exists naturally. It does not. Behind every stable factory, stable workflow, or stable company, somebody is usually absorbing chaos quietly before leadership ever sees it. And when executives stop respecting the people holding those systems together, the collapse rarely begins with drama. It begins with assumptions no one bothered to verify anymore.